What is going on with the bond market? Will the Federal Reserve be able to raise rates? Are the yield curves flattening? And what does even all that mean? What's happening in the credit default swaps markets? This is the amount of money people are willing to pay for insurance against their bets. We've seen China spiking, almost doubling just since the beginning of the year. And while the whole world looks like it's going crazy, you maybe aren't paying attention. Maybe you don't understand it, and that's okay, but you need to. If you're investing into equities, you have to know what the debt is doing. And that's why I'm joined by one of my good friends, my Oz brother. I'm talking about Greg Foss. He's a 30-year veteran bond market trader. He's going to come talk to us about the bond market, what's going on, what's happening with the credit default swaps, what you need to be paying attention to if you're investing at all. We talk about mathematically what this tells us about the world, about trust being at an all-time low. He's a Canadian, I think he said a fifth generation Canadian, and we talk about what happened in Canada with the truckers, how he got involved, and actually the trouble that he's facing for that, what that means for Canada, back into what this means even bigger and broader for the world. And then I ask him to give me some end of the world scenarios, what has to happen for certain things to happen, and some price targets for some of my favorite assets. So much good ground to cover with Greg Foss. Now, by the way, Greg Foss is going to be one of the speakers at the Market Disruptors Live 2022. That's coming up in a couple of months. There's a link down below. And I have about 15 of the best speakers in the world that are experts in each of their own niches coming to tell us, one, what they think is going to happen over the next couple of years, and two, what they are doing, what you should be doing to prepare for this. I'm talking about Harry Dent, the master of cycles and demographics. I'm talking about Danielle DiMartino Booth, a real Fed insider. I'm talking about Greg Foss, of course, Jeff Booth, my good buddy George Gammon, and so many more. There's a link down below. Do not miss Market Disruptors Live 2022. And with that, let's go ahead and just jump right into the interview with Greg Foss. Hey, Greg, welcome back to the show. It's always a pleasure to hang out and talk to you, and thanks for coming back.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Mark. It was great to see you a week and a half ago down in Las Vegas. That was a great time.
Oh, that was such a good time. That was, for people watching, that was Tone Bays did a conference called Unconfiscatable.
And I'm wearing that's my Bitcoin shirt right here.
Oh, yeah.
I'm wearing the t-shirt.
I like that shirt. I was wondering what that said. Yeah. You know what? They gave me a ticket for a free t-shirt, and now I'm thinking about it, I never went and claimed it. Dang it.
Well, you got it. You got to take all the swag you can get at these things.
Yeah, that was a good event. I liked it because it was like pretty small, and there was a couple hundred people there. Good time. Just
solid people. I can't tell you. Calling out a few of my new friends now, the crypto couple. Those two are top shelf. Like absolutely solid, passionate, very, very knowledgeable. And I thought the whole event was just amazing.
Yeah. I love being able to get out and meet new people. I had just met them for the first time. I think I ran into them once in Miami, but I just, other than hi, didn't say anything. But getting to spend time with you, all those conversations. I always recommend to everybody they should get out to events. Oh, speaking of events, you're going to be speaking at the Market Disruptors Live event coming up in May, and so anyone listening, if you want to come hang out with me and Greg, you should definitely check that out. We'll put a link down below to that. And then I believe we'll both be at the Bitcoin Miami conference coming up.
Yeah.
So that's going to be.
I'm looking forward to your event, Mark, because when we did it, I can't remember. It's certainly less than 5 months ago, right?
November last year.
November in Miami, and that thing just rocked it. Like I enjoyed every moment of that. I learned a ton. That's the key for me. I get to go to these things and learn from other people. So
yeah.
Just so great.
I'm pretty excited. I have, I guess just to plug it a little bit, but since you're coming, I'll hype it up a little bit. But, I talk a lot about cycles, these cycles that repeat. And somebody who I'll probably learn the most from is Harry Dent. His work on cycles is like the best there is, demographics, and he's coming to speak.
Oh, great.
So Harry Dent's going to be there. Now, I've interviewed him before. A lot of people don't like Harry Dent because he's always wrong. But
how so? He's been so right.
He's been so right. And I've read, I think, 5 of his books at least.
Okay.
He's been wrong on the timing lately, right? He's been calling for the big crash since like 2017.
Yeah. You know what? It's only math though. That my tagline. Like,
Yeah.
Harry, at some point you got to understand you can't push on a string any longer, right? When interest rates get as low as they are, it's very unlikely that they're going to go below zero. Now it's possible, but you got to play the probabilities. And I think he's had this theme. And by the way, credit where credit is due. He's been a bond market bull since I've been in the market for the last 30 years, if I'm not mistaken. So look, I would just say though, it's very hard for bulls to change their stripes. And right, it's you can call for negative rates, but that's a dangerous game.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm having him. I'm saying people criticize him, but I've read like 5 of his books. I believe he's right. I believe his research is right. His data is right. His math is right. He's underestimated how long these central bankers can keep this thing going. I think
Fair.
that's his fault.
Maybe like Steven, right? When at your last conference in Miami, and we both agree, like Steven Van Meter does not want to own bonds for a 30-year period from
Right.
time zero, let's call it last November, for 30 years. But he was viewing it as a trade opportunity,
Right.
where things would, gap lower in yields, which would mean that bond prices would gap higher.
Mm-hmm.
It's fighting a pretty tough battle right now.
Yeah.
And I have one expression, another one, Mark. I'm not the type of guy to be picking up nickels in front of a steamroller, right?
Right.
Like I don't need that last. There's a famous investor, I can't remember who it was, but he had a great line. He goes, someone said, what do you attribute your success? And his answer was, I always sold too early. Meaning,
yeah.
I knew when to exit a trade, all right? And I didn't try and get the last, X% out of the trade or squeeze the last blood out of the stone. It was time to exit it and move on to other things. And maybe that's just the case where you've lived in a bond market that has for 40 years been a bull market. At some point, mathematically, it's over. Then at what point thematically do you admit that the risks of holding on, even if you do believe that things are going to implode and that rates have to go ultimately negative, at what point do you just, throw in the towel and say, hey, it's been a great ride?
Yeah.
Right. That's key.
Yeah. I heard somebody say, I can tell you what's going to happen, or I can tell you the time, but I can't tell you both.
It's a great thing. You don't ever give a target and a time, right? So people say, I know what my target price, and I'm going to switch gears a bit. I know what my target price on Bitcoin is. And then people always say, so over what time? And I go, look, I'll give a target, but not a time. I don't need to.
Well, maybe I heard that from you.
It could have been. It's like that you don't get roped into giving both a target and a time, because you'll be wrong on one of them.
Yeah, actually, so maybe I got those wise words from you. Yeah, so on top of Harry Dent coming, so I'm super excited to talk to him. I got Danielle DiMartino Booth coming.
Oh yeah, she was great. I saw her at the Bretton Woods conference in August that I attended, and she was very, very solid.
So an actual Fed insider, so that's cool. Luke Grauman, who's been nailing
off the charts good.
Yeah, Luke Grauman's been nailing all this stuff, so he's been really good. George Gammon, my good buddy, he's coming back again.
Nice.
And of course, your good buddy, our mutual friend Jeff Booth, he's coming.
Awesome.
So it's gonna be amazing.
Okay.
So we had the war on COVID, which is a war, and I mean, from a government standpoint, they kind of mobilized like they would with a war, which was unlimited amounts of stimulus, emergency powers, and now we have another war in the Middle East. And it's driving the markets insane. The stocks are down, obviously, but it's really the credit markets that seem to be going insane, both with high yield spreads going like crazy, credit default swaps going like crazy. So I want to talk to you about that. Being a 30-year bond trader focused on the credit markets, what are you seeing going on in the world? What's your take on that?
Well, I'll be very honest. It's nowhere near as bad as it could get. So credit drives equity markets, as I've said before, and I know you know that. If we think we've seen something bad as of now, we have not seen anything. And spreads are widening, and credit default spreads are widening. So there's contagion all through the credit markets, whether it's bank funding, whether it's sovereign default swap spreads, whether it's high yield spreads, leverage loan. It's just like a domino effect, right?
Yeah.
But they are nowhere near any point of stress compared to the COVID crisis or the great financial crisis. So if we think that we've put a bottom in equities in any way, shape, or form, I would caution people to reevaluate that assumption. Equities can fall a whole lot further. They do have a lot further to fall because they have, climbed a ladder for so long. Doesn't necessarily mean they will. Spreads and equity spreads, credit spreads and leverage loan spreads have narrowed to a point where they were at historical narrows because equity markets were so frothy. Now, as you know, equity ranks subordinate to the credit.
Right.
And if you have a very big buffer due to the equity market, those spreads can narrow. The flip side is, though, that as equity sells off and that buffer narrows, spreads have to widen. And they have not even come close to widening towards the widest levels seen in 2020 due to COVID, nor, and hopefully never, to the levels seen in the great financial crisis in 2008, 2009. So we have a long way to go for that to happen, which means equity markets have a long way to fall if that's going to be the case.
Yeah. Now, I've heard you say before that, if the reason why the proverbial dog wagging the tail, the bonds wagging the stocks,
yes,
is because if the debt's worthless, then the equity's worthless.
Correct.
Right,
Well,
because
or if the debt, to be honest, if the debt's not worth 100% of claim, meaning there's some sort of you've lost money or you've been disadvantaged at the debt level, meaning you're only getting 90 cents on the dollar at the debt level, there is no claim on the equity. That's just the way that priority of claims works. So
right.
Unless the debt is worth 100 cents on the dollar, the equity is worth zero. Now, that doesn't mean that the claim doesn't translate into some sort of workout scenario,
Right.
but in the court of law, unless the debt is worth 100 cents on the dollar, the equity has no claim on any residual value.
Yeah, because I was just thinking, like, I guess if the company doesn't get completely liquidated, let's just say that they have to go through a restructuring, they have to restructure the
Right.
debt, and the bonds get paid at 50 cents on the dollar,
Sure,
whatever it is, but the
yeah.
equity is still there, and potentially that company could rebound, and that equity could get back to its full valuation.
Well, yes, but don't forget. So that equity that's left. So what happens is, at a claim where the debt gets a haircut, the equity gets 10 times the haircut. Now, generally in a workout, they don't cut the equity to zero because there's a process where the claimants organize into creditor classes, and there's an organized or a restructuring that's agreed upon where the equity probably gets in the order of less than 10% of its original value. Okay.
Right.
It turns into an option essentially, Mark. Okay. Now, it's not to say that this company can't recreate itself and turn into an enterprise valuation that will make that option value worth more than it was. But the likelihood of that happening is always remote. And you've given away 90% of your value in that restructuring. That's just the way it works. It's priority of claim. Debt always has a priority of claim over the equity in a restructuring.
Right. So you said that things are bad, but they're nowhere near as bad as we saw in 2008. So we're a long way from that.
Yes.
What type of historical reference would you kind of put for where we're at right now? Maybe not just where
2019,
we're at.
just,
Okay.
even 2014, when the euro was, when people were struggling with this whole concept of the euro and Eurozone, and Draghi came out and said, "We will do whatever it takes." You remember those famous words? So this is just a point where, and all credit spreads are, and this is very important for people to understand, but all that credit is confidence, right? Because there's no magic solution to credit. It's a contract. So it's not like you can wish something higher because some analyst comes out and says, oh my goodness, this company is going to increase sales some crazy amount that'll translate into an equity valuation increasing.
Right.
That bond is a contract. It's a set mathematical formula.
But you have
There's
to have you have to trust that they'll pay,
you
be able to
have
pay
to
that.
trust. Okay.
Yeah.
So that is the subjectivity. But other than that, there's no subjectivity to it. It's a contract. If you make that payment, you've satisfied your contract.
Yeah.
If you don't make that payment, or is there's concern that you don't make that payment, that's where confidence is lost in the market.
Right.
That'll trickle down. Obviously, if confidence is lost in the credit of a company, let's not talk about the equity, because the equity is a subordinate claim.
Right.
So that's why I always say, if you're an equity investor and you do not understand what the leverage is of that company or where the debt of that company is trading, you have not done your homework, because you
Right.
better not get into a subordinate claim in that structure if you don't understand what the guys who ranked prior to you are thinking.
Yeah. Yeah. As somebody, as an entrepreneur who've started dozens of businesses and invested in lots of other small businesses, and I've invested in a lot of friends' businesses and things, families' businesses. And I look at those things very clearly, like,
Yes.
well, what debt do you have? What's your game
Right.
plan? Will you be able to repay this debt? All these things. But then it's easy to lose sight of that when you're buying a publicly traded company and you don't really think about it like investing in a small business, but it should be.
You
maybe.
absolutely can. And here's the greatest
Well,
thing.
oh, you can. I'm just saying people lose it.
Mark, here's the neat thing, right? Whereas you just did everything you had to do, the cool thing about a publicly traded company is that it's likely that the debt is also publicly traded.
Right.
And you can get a price on that debt. And that price will give you an indication of what the bond market thinks of the likelihood of repayment on the bonds. And if all I'm saying is, if the bond market questions the contractual obligation being paid with 100% certainty, don't get involved down in the equity without a huge option or asymmetric opportunity. Whereas I know I could lose everything, but if I don't, I better be able to make 10
Right.
times my money, not one times. I better be able to make 10 times
Right.
to offset the downside risk, right?
Yeah. So if the historical reference is 19,
Yes.
and
That's a
obviously
good one. That's a good one. But why 19 or 2014? It's a time when we think we're heading into recession. We could be heading into recession, but it's not there yet. And things haven't unraveled, where banks don't trust each other, where it's hard to hold your deposits in a bank because you're like, I'm not really sure I'll get my deposit back if I keep it in the bank, right?
Well, now we have nations that are asking that question.
I've never been more scared that something will unravel quickly in my life. And this is what's happened, I think, with successive financial crises. What I find is the implosion is quicker, right? In successive financial crises that I've been involved in, the first one took 3 years to play itself out. The second one took like 2.5 years. The Great Financial Crisis took 2 years. COVID took less than a year. This next one could happen in 3 months, right? It's compressed because the reaction time is, they don't have any more time to mess around. Like, they have to come in with all the cavalry. They have to come in with QE infinity. Don't even pretend that we're not going to be QE infinity forever. And we have to restructure our financial system.
Right. Well, back to kind of Harry Dent, his analysis has been right. The timing has been wrong. I think just because he maybe underestimated, the length these central bankers can go to. You mentioned the comment in 2014 from Draghi, which I do remember that very vividly, because I remember at that point when he said, basically we'll do whatever it takes. To your point, it was like, that was like, we pushed all our chips in, like on a poker game. It's like, I'm all in. I remember that vividly because it was like, he made that all in moment. And so like, it was like, well, if this doesn't work, then there's nothing
But
left.
you know what he also did is he called out the shorts, right? Like, basically, so there were guys that were like, oh boy, he has bigger bullets than I do still, right? And the key is, this is what always happens in a game is when you realize the guy who's trying to bluff doesn't have anything behind it.
Right.
And this will happen to the greatest central bank or the most powerful central bank in the world, which is the Fed. And I'm not saying we're there yet, but when it happens, it'll be actually pathetic. It'll be like the guy has nothing, right?
Right.
You're sitting at a poker table and you realize that the sweat is pouring down his forehead
Yeah.
and you realize that his bluff is no longer. So this is why I say, and this is going to bring it back to Bitcoin, why Bitcoin is the perfect option, because you need insurance on the Fed put not being there anymore, where the Federal Reserve has always said, I'm gonna bail everybody out. Imagine though they say I'm gonna bail everybody out and the market says, you know what? I don't believe you can. And then all of a sudden the Fed's cards, he has to put his cards on the table and the people will realize there's nothing there. So that's why you need a insurance policy called Bitcoin, which is essentially a put on the Fed put. You need to own insurance on the Fed not having the cards in their hand that everybody thinks they do.
Well, let's table that for now, because I want to come back to that.
Sure.
I've put down a couple questions here that I want to get back to you before we close. One about that, and one more on a thought that I have about that. But back to something that you said though, which was it all depends on how fast it unravels. When people think they can't trust the system anymore, and I said sort of like we just found out nations are probably asking themselves that question. I was speaking specifically of Russia,
Okay.
and right where I mean. In Canada, very quickly, we can jump into that in a second. But in Canada, very quickly, people found out that their money wasn't safe in the bank. And even if I were even to donate money to a perfectly legal thing, it put me in danger. And so, okay, that's bad. And that alerted, North America that their money's not safe. People, even companies. But then we saw one of three sovereign nations with nuclear weapons. I say there's three global superpowers. The rest are tier 2 nations, but I mean, Russia, China, and US with nukes, and they got their bank accounts frozen. So what does that tell the other nations of the world that are using it as a reserve?
Yeah, you better be paying attention right now. So let's flip it to my home nation. And this is a game of probabilities, right? So it doesn't matter where you live, you always have to play probabilities. So playing probabilities from my perspective in Canada, if you had asked me 3 years ago, whether in the next 20 years from 3 years ago, if Canada would ever freeze people's bank accounts on the basis of something like this, I would have said, yes, it's possible, but maybe 20% probability in a 20-year time frame, right?
Right.
Well, not only in the last 3 years has it happened with 100% certainty, but it's happened with a severity that's opened the eyes of the world, because Canada is was a pretty democratic place where the rule of law, the rule of possession applied. And all of a sudden it was gone in a heartbeat, Mark. And look, I'm part of a group that's been named in a civil lawsuit that has been heretofore, in hindsight, defined as some sort of terrorist group. And I mean, come on, you can't rewrite history. Like, you don't go from being a freedom platoon, if you will, to a terrorist group just because some sort of government official says, well, in his eyes, it's a terrorist group. Well, this is what we're living.
Let me frame that up a little bit for everybody, because obviously you and I are caught up on the situation. But let me backfill this story a little bit. So Canada being a democratic country, having a rule of law, what we've really seen is the entire world has gone from a rule of law to be ruled by men. And instead of having a rule of law, we're ruled by men who arbitrarily change the rules whenever they want. Jumping back to Russia, for example, the U.S. just applied sanctions to a whole country and started seizing people's yachts. No due process, just because they just felt like it. But even back here, in the U.S., it was like, oh, you can't have people in your restaurant anymore. You can eat outside. Oh, you can't eat outside anymore. Now you can do inside with plexiglass and 30%, like arbitrarily. And in Canada, back to Canada, all of a sudden you weren't allowed to honk your horn. That was a crime. Like, you can't honk. That's a crime.
like you can't just like arbitrarily like have a man that just says whatever he wants. But even more specifically, back to your stories. To catch people up on the story, obviously, unless you've been living under a rock, you understand what's going on in Canada. And you had a protest, and I believe, like the U.S., Canada, and correct me if I'm wrong, has like the freedom to assemble, and you can
Yes.
peacefully protest. So this was legally protected. They were not burning down buildings or anything like that. They were legally assembled. And then there was a GoFundMe that was set up, and people had donated to this, to a legal thing. That account got frozen. And then people decided to raise money through Bitcoin, which was, again, for a legally protected protest. And then they changed the rules arbitrarily, like you can't honk and you can't donate. But then they tried to retroactively apply
Yeah.
those. Is that what happened?
That's as great a summary as there could be. The one thing I'll add, and this is, you know, it accelerated, and it became a life of its own in the parliament, because the ruling party never went down and talked to the truckers. Now, this was a peaceful process. In fact, even when the government brought in the riot police, and the riot police were being aggressive to the truckers, these men and women were the most disciplined protesters I could ever imagine in my life.
Yeah.
And they, they didn't resist. They peacefully protested right until the last minute. And to be honest, look, I supported them. I'm not telling people that I was right or wrong. I supported the freedom aspect of it. Was not an anti-vax position for myself. I have friends who are friends of yours as well that supported them. But what it came right down to, Mark, is this was a peaceful protest for freedom, and the government never once had the guts to stand up and talk to the protesters, to acknowledge their right to protest, and in fact then started painting them with lines like terrorists, swastikas, all this stuff. Very childish behavior. And you mentioned men. It wasn't just men, it was women in the parliament as well.
Sure. Well,
a certain lady, Krista Freeland, who quite honestly, as a Canadian, is a disgraceful politician. And I'll go on record as saying that, because it is not how freedom is supposed to, be undertaken. So it happened quickly. It happened really quickly.
Especially in a democratic country. So Justin Trudeau kept saying, well, at first it was a fringe minority. It didn't represent Canadians, didn't represent what they wanted. And I asked myself, like, how does he know that? Did they run a poll? Was there a vote? Right. And so the way I looked at it is in the US election cycle, the last election that we saw, the polls were so far off, because anybody can just say what they want in a poll. The betting markets were extremely accurate, because people put their money where their mouth is. And so using a Greg Foss line, it's just math. You look at, let's look at the money, right? Because that's where people put their skin in the game. And so, we didn't take a poll, which don't work. We didn't take a vote, but what we did do is we put our money where our mouth is. So, for example, Justin Trudeau's campaign raised about $3 million in the quarter leading up to the event. The truckers raised over $15 million.
Oh man, I didn't know that. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, well, actually, just the GoFundMe alone, not including the GiveSendGo and the Bitcoin, none of that. Just the GoFundMe alone raised more than every single Canadian political party combined for the previous 3 months.
Crap, that's crazy. Well, but this is, and here's the thing. Okay, so look, let's moving it back to how Canada is a fraction of what the United States is. We're 1/10 of the population. We're 1/10 of the gross domestic product. But I mentioned that I saw you in Las Vegas. And when I left Las Vegas, I went skiing in Colorado for a couple of days. But then I made my way back from Colorado back to Toronto driving. And I was driving through the prairies, or the flatlands of the United States, like Colorado and Nebraska. And I promise you, I saw Canadian flags in Nebraska and in the in the Midwest. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Canadian flags in the Midwest? And I'm not saying, look, but they were basically saying, thank you, Canadian truckers, for standing up for freedom of speech. I don't want any more enemies. God knows, gosh knows I have as many as I need. But I just tell people, please understand what I was standing up for, and what a lot of the truckers were standing up for, was the right to protest, the right to have a dialogue, that no one has to dictate to us just because what they see is the right outcome. So listen, Mark, I'll tell you, going through, I saw these signs, it brought tears to my eyes, much like the truckers, the Freedom Convoy, and those videos that you would have seen. I'll tell you, I was from a fifth generation Canadian, which I am, whose granddad and his great uncle fought in both world wars. Not that wars are anything good, but when someone called them up to defend freedom, they both answered the call. I'm like, dang, I need to stand and take a stance where that's needed. And at this point, haven't totally lost confidence in Canada, but things are awfully pear-shaped right now. We have dictators and we have politicians that sense entitlement versus speaking for the people. And you know what I love is the United States acknowledge this in certain parts, and there's Canadian flags. And I saw a Canadian flag down in Las Vegas, more than one. And I'm like, okay, this doesn't exist on a regular basis. This is acknowledgement of what the truckers did in Canada.
Yeah. Well, I would say that it was a success either way. And I want to just back up a second, because you were very clear that it wasn't I don't even want to say the word on YouTube, but you weren't anti-medicine. Let's just say that. It wasn't that. And they tried to paint it that way. And I've been talking about this a lot. I've done a lot of work in historical cycles, 250-year revolution cycles.
Yes.
And this is not about this is not about this medicine. It's about mandates. It's about government overreach. And so even before the pandemic, so if we go back to December of 2019, at the time, there was 10 countries with over 1 million people each in the streets protesting.
Wow.
And so, we still have it, and they were protesting then, just like they're protesting now, which is about government overreach.
Yes.
And so, yes, it's about mandates. It's about medicine mandates at this point, but it would have been against another mandate. It's about government overreach, I think is the key piece there. Yeah. I don't know if you want to talk about this, but I know, this is somewhat relevant. So obviously rules by men, they just arbitrarily changed the rules. Then we saw front and center that your money in the bank isn't your money. They froze that. Yeah. Then even money that was donated legally got seized. Then even a company that said, hey, Canada has no jurisdiction over us, the Give Send Go, got their bank accounts frozen.
Yes.
And then Bitcoin came front and center because, well, Bitcoin is censorship resistant money, which I think worked really well, thrust it onto the world stage. However, there's quite a bit of fallout from that, I think, with you and some other people involved. Is that like from the government, like, or is that like private?
Yeah, well,
stuff?
So it started as a civil suit, and then so here's to give the listeners some context. Myself, another. I guess I could call influencer, certainly a way bigger influencer than I am. A friend of both of ours, Jeff Booth, we agreed to basically vouch for the validity of any Bitcoin that was raised on behalf of the Canadian truckers, that the Bitcoin that was raised would make its way to the truckers rather than make its way to some nefarious account run by Greg Foss and family, or whatever. Right. So anyway, we put our names on the line, and I'm proud that I did it. And although my wife would ask me never to do it again, I would do it again. Okay. Like, I'm not trying to lose my marriage, but I did it because I believed in the cause, as you said. I think Jeff Booth would do it again, but I can't put words into his mouth. The point is, right before we sensed that things were going to get ugly, we transferred ownership of our keys to the Bitcoin account, to other third parties or signatories, so that since we lived in Canada, there'd be less of a point of failure. So Jeff and I exited the fundraise platform, or the eye of the fundraise, and it was left with, amongst others, a gentleman who lives in Ottawa who goes by the sign at Nobody Caribou, and one of the lead truckers in the convoy, to distribute the Bitcoin. Here's where things get a little scary now, Mark, is that people who had donated to any of the causes, whether it was GoFundMe, whether it was GiftSendGo, whether it was an address that was identified by a Bitcoin wallet, the government came after those people and was able to freeze, in certain cases, the funds of the people, just because the government didn't agree with the use of proceeds, if you will. And this is the dangerous part, right? Who says that the government, just
That's
because you don't
problem.
agree with the government, they can freeze your funds? And here's the crazy part. Krista Freeland has said that those bank accounts that were frozen and have since become unfrozen, they'll be permanently marked. There will be some sort of mark on that bank account, or the individual that owns that bank account forever, that they were deemed as anti-government. And this is like, that's a scary thing. All right. And all I will say is, my hat goes off to all the Bitcoiners out there that raised the money for freedom. And there were vaxxers and anti-vaxxers in that. There were people from the Americas. There were people from all around the world. We got money in the fund from people in communist nations in the world that basically said, please do this for freedom. And, you know, a couple of the ones, this is off the path, but I hate Greg Foss. Here's some money because I hate Foss. You know what I mean? It was quite funny, Mark.
Yeah.
And or funny, but it was a movement. And all I will say is, it was so invigorating for us. And we raised a couple, a bit over $1 million US. And Nick in Ottawa at Nobody Caribou absolutely went above and beyond to distribute the money to the truckers. We are currently in court, so I got to be careful what I say. And I'm just telling the truth. And as long as I tell the truth, I feel I won't get in trouble. Well, that could be wrong, but I feel I'm telling the truth, so I'm doing everything that God asked me to do and whatnot. Here's where it comes down to. The Bitcoin community is the coolest, most supportive, the most invigorating community I've ever been involved with in my life. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts, because Bitcoin is freedom, and this was consistent with the values of the Bitcoin community.
Yeah. And I would say that it was a big success, even though the truckers didn't get exactly what they wanted. It did bring attention to it globally. I think it exposed, how corrupt the Canadian government is. I mean, at least Trudeau, in bed with the WF, and what their bigger agenda is. It exposed the dangers of government-controlled money, especially as we transition to a CBD place. It brought Bitcoin censorship-resistant money to the front and center. And so I think it succeeded on all those levels.
And I think you'll see. So this is now public knowledge. One of the lead convoy truckers, BJ Dichter, has been invited to speak at the Bitcoin conference in Miami.
I saw that. Yeah.
Excited to listen to him speak.
Yeah.
I think that people understand the importance of censorship resistant money. They also appreciate, or are more concerned, if you will, with a government that that'll never happen, right? Oh, they'll never do that.
Yeah.
And then when push comes to shove, not only did they do it, they did it with a ferocity that it made your head spin. Like, you didn't have a chance to defend yourself. There was no innocent until proven guilty.
Nope.
You were guilty.
Yeah.
And in the eyes of the government, that's just it. You're done. And look, again, I'll just say, look, I promise you that my granddad, who fought in both world wars and was quite, he was awarded some very prestigious medals. he didn't fight in those wars. And he's talking to me in the back of his head. He's like, or
Yeah.
in the back of my mind, he's like, come on, Greg, you know, you got to stand up for this stuff. So
Yeah.
I'm not going to die. I'm not going to, you know, pretend that anything I'm doing is nearly as noble as
Sure.
what they did, but it's in the same process, right?
Yeah, I love it. My grandfather was also decorated in World War II. My father, you know, and he was drafted in World War II. My father was drafted into Vietnam. He didn't want to go. He flew jets in Vietnam, so dangerous.
Wow.
And he was still in the Air Force when I was born. And I thought one day I would go to war. I just thought, you know, that's the way it would go. You know, this is kind of it for us. Hopefully, this is it for us. It's not to compare it to what they had to do, the sacrifice they made, but people are afraid to speak up anymore. I want to kind of tie this back into, for everybody that's listened through this so far, tie this back into the finance side.
Sure.
And the reason we can tie this back is because you were talking about, if we had this historical narrative, we go back to like 2019, but you talked about how, especially with the debt, but really the whole system is so fragile based on trust. And I've talked a lot about how censorship destroys trust. Instead of being open and transparent, which builds trust, censorship, it destroys it. But this, you know, between all the stuff that's happened, really, but just then with Canada and then Russia happening, I mean, that just destroys the trust of the people and even other nations. And so if you look at it through that lens, and then going back to the central bank's ability to kind of keep these markets propped up, and will we trust them to bail the system out if it crashes again next time? But now looking at it through the lens of all this trust that was just destroyed, torpedoed on purpose, do you think that changes the outlook of the future? I mean, they're going to have way
Great
less
question.
chance, right?
Yeah, yes, way less chance. And basically they have destroyed a lot of the trust. But when you ask people, and I'll put myself in this camp still, and we said this in Las Vegas, because a lot of Bitcoiners foresee the end of the current system we live in, which is fine, the fiat system, but they want it to happen now, and they want it to happen with some sort of severity that punishes people.
Right.
And look, I'm a little more, okay, let's try and plan this more, right? And we've talked about this, Mark. We want some sort of parallel system that can exist so that the transition is somewhat orderly.
Yep.
Because right now, all trust is basically as low as I've ever seen it in my 30 years of trading in markets that require trust. And it's lower because the actions by the government have proven that they should be lower.
Yep.
On the one hand. And then on the second hand, and this is more important, we've lived through 4 crises, and the solution for each crisis has been the same. Quantitative easing, print more money, lower rates, flood the system with liquidity.
Right.
All that kicking the can down the road does is open people's eyes to the eventual collapse will be more painful than ever the same type of collapse could have been the first time. Well, we were scared to do it the first time, so the next collapse is going to be bigger, et cetera, et cetera. This cannot go on forever. It will not go on forever. Do I want it to go on for a little more? Yes, I do, because I think that the pain in the short term would be way, way higher than if we can put together this parallel system so that when it finally does start to collapse, we can go to this parallel system. Yeah. That parallel system, as you know, in my mind, is Bitcoin. Yeah. I believe it is in your mind as well. Yep. But we're not ready for it yet. And there is a positive outcome. And I need to say this. There is an outcome where the United States maintains its global dominance, both from a financial status as well as from a global military status, where if the US embraces this parallel system, they will be able to put in place a future that is open to everybody, but they have had a head start. And that's what you do if you plan properly.
Yeah. I've also talked a lot about the parallel system. A channel on YouTube that you should go check out, everybody listening. It's called Academy of Ideas. And this guy makes these videos, or 10, 12-minute videos, and they are hard hitting. I've been paying my kids to go watch these videos and write me summaries on them. And he talks a lot about it, and specifically around the period of the 70s and the 80s when the USSR fell.
Okay.
And he talks a lot about the writings of Václav Havel, who was in prison for his writings and went on to become the president of Czechoslovakia.
Oh, wow.
Solzhenitsyn, that wrote these books. But anyway, they talked about it was what really led to the collapse of the Soviet or the USSR and the soft landing for the people, to your point, was through setting up parallel systems.
Okay.
And so what happened is, because the USSR was so strict, communism was so strict, people couldn't get any food, everything was rationed, they couldn't do all these things. And so they started doing everything black market, right? So parallel system, think about
Yes.
black market, whatever the government doesn't allow.
Okay.
And so everybody had figured out how to get their sugar and how to get their corn and how to get their flour and everything. Everyone lived outside of the system in this parallel structure. And that did two things. So one, it sped up the inevitable collapse of the system because they couldn't be controlled by the system anymore. If I take my money out and go into Bitcoin, their financial sanctions don't matter to me anymore.
Okay.
The schools teach crazy stuff in California. I've pulled my kids out of those schools. They can keep teaching
Right.
whatever they want. It doesn't affect me anymore, right? Mainstream media can say whatever they want. I don't watch it, and I've set up my own media channels, right? So it's we've moved to these parallel structures, which one, limit their ability to sanction us or to affect us, but two, then we have that set up so when the inevitable collapse comes, we're already operating in that other system. And so that's what happened to the USSR. And even today, through most of those states that were balkanized, largely like through the pandemic of 2020 and et cetera, the last 2 years, a lot of them weren't that affected because they still kind of have these alternative parallel systems set up. So
Interesting.
there's a good historical narrative for that. Check that out. To
As
learn more
always,
about that.
I learned stuff from you, man. So that's
Yeah.
cool. Like
So,
history is very cool.
Yeah, so Academy of Ideas. So,
Okay.
so jumping back into this, so if trust is at an all-time low, now one thing that we know is that I've seen several polls that have been run in the United States, and they show that trust is the lowest it's been in ever, basically.
Okay.
But from the financial standpoint, we've seen like the credit default swaps. So when debt is about to go bad, or you want to insure your bets, you can buy insurance against that. You've talked a lot about that. I see that the banks are spiking, seems like to historically high
Yeah.
levels. So Citibank, Goldman, Morgan Stanley seem like they're like, I mean, people are buying like crazy amounts of insurance on those where the insurance is going higher. And then like China is like more than doubled since December back to where it was in 2020. Is that the mathematical equation of the polls telling us that trust is being
Yeah.
lost?
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. I can't say it any other way. And I will say though, that it is like anything else. It's a free market. It's beautiful because there's nobody in there taking the other side. It's not like the US government is selling protection on itself, right? That would be
Right.
like buying fire insurance from some sort of pyromaniac, right? So you can't buy insurance on the US government defaulting from the US government. That's
Right.
buying fire insurance from a pyromaniac, right?
Yeah.
So, but it is, and it's an open market. It's free, free expression. I'll caution everyone to understand how credit markets work, though, is there is contagion, right? There'll never be one market that spikes without other markets being impacted, because one of the things a hedge fund guy can do, where I spent my life, is let's say I trade high yield credit and its spreads are widening and I need protection. I can go to emerging markets and I can buy protection on an emerging market.
Right.
Because they always trade in lockstep. And if emerging market spreads haven't widened, but high yield spreads have widened, hey, I'll buy some cheap insurance on emerging markets, anticipating that the spreads in emerging markets will widen. And people need to understand, in an insurance policy, it doesn't have to be an event of default where you make money. All you have to do is buy an insurance policy at a price that over time, the price of that same insurance policy goes higher. You can turn around and sell your insurance policy that you bought at a lower price for a higher price, and you've made money.
Yeah.
Right? There's no default event that's occurred. You've made money by buying cheap insurance and selling it on into the market at a higher price. So everyone says, oh, you buy insurance and there's no default. That doesn't mean you can't make money. You can turn
Right.
around and sell your insurance, at which point you're naked and you don't have insurance anymore. You sold your whole policy, but you've still made money because you bought it at a price and was able to sell it at a higher price. That's the beauty of open market polling, as you talked about. It's the same thing as, the polls are always more accurate when there's money on the line in terms of who's going to come out in an election result.
Yeah. So we know trust is at an all-time low. Polls have told us that. Now we talked about the CDS, the credit default swaps. We can see governments torpedoing their own trust through Canada, Russia, changing laws, et cetera. And so I guess let's transition maybe to kind of like the last topic then, which is if trust is at an all-time low, debt levels are unsustainable. We know all these things. Interest rates are at zero. You said you don't know if they'll be able to go negative, but they are negative in most parts of the world, and they're negative compared to where inflation is, real rates.
Correct.
Anyway.
That's the key thing. Let's just focus on that.
Yeah. So this is a speculative or a guess, I guess. And you had said earlier, there's going to be a point where they won't be able to save it. Like the Fed won't be able to save it. Now, US dollar and US dollar treasuries have always been the risk-free trade because the government will always pay its debt. They'll just print more money. And so because they can print more money, they're paying you with devalued dollars, obviously. But if they can just print more money to always pay their debts, what would it take for to get to a point where they're not able to do that then?
Well, they will still be able to do it, Mark. It's just whether it means anything. It's like
whether anybody would take it.
No, they'll take it. They'll just put it on the curb and throw it out as garbage, right? That's what happened in Venezuela. And try not to overthink this. It's the same process. And like I say, look, the USA will be the last fiat currency to fail. The second to last will be the European Union, and the weak sisters failing essentially are already failed, but Germany is what held in the Portugals and Italy's and the Spain's of the world in the European Union. But it'll be the second one, second to last one. But Canada will fail 10 years before the USA fails.
Oh, wow. That long.
Oh, in my opinion, yes. I could be wrong. It could be 5 years, but it'll definitely be an advance and could be a serious contagion event, right? Where Canada fails. And then the United States says, damn, one of our largest trading partners and our northern border, which, they're out of business. And people in the USA will be like, well, how come we're any different? And some people will realize they're not. It's as Voltaire said, every single fiat will fail, or every fiat will return to its intrinsic value, which is basically the value of the paper it's printed on, right?
Or less,
Okay, so there's 180 fiats in the world, and some of them are serial defaulters. We talked about Argentina failing 4 times in my professional career.
Yeah.
That's a G20 country. So look, it'll happen. I don't want it to happen quickly, but it will happen. Whether it happens in my lifetime or my kid's lifetime, that's irrelevant. You need to prepare for it because it's only mathematics. It is happening. We are getting to a point where the DEBT debt spiral is accelerating because the debt balloon is getting so big that finally some grade 1 kid is going to say to his teacher, how is this possible?
Yeah.
And the teacher is going to say, well, it's always been that way. And then the kids are going to be like, well, it's got to stop because it cannot continue. I don't want my money or the money of my kids going into supporting this fiat Ponzi. Hopefully, and I'm confident there will be a parallel system that exists so that you have a savings or a store of value called Bitcoin that will protect your energy, your monetary energy, and you could still have fiat currency that'll be used for transaction purposes, but you got better spend it quick because that if you don't spend it this week, next week it'll take twice as much to transact for the same value.
just not the reserve asset. All right. And then the last question I want to ask is, you had put out this big paper
Yes.
outlining, the bonds and the default swaps, and you talked about the Fulcrum Index.
Oh yeah.
And you talked about how you could kind of give a price to Bitcoin based off the pricing of what the credit default swaps
Man, I love
were.
you. I love you.
And credit default swaps have spiked, as I just said earlier. Like China has
Right.
more than doubled just since December alone.
Right.
So how does the rapidly rising CDS
Yeah.
pricing affect the price of
Bitcoin's
Bitcoin?
gone
based
up
on-
to the intrinsic value of Bitcoin has basically doubled since I wrote that paper. And I promise people we didn't rehearse this, but the greatest thing is, Mark, I'm involved in a new education platform where we are coming out with we're reissuing that paper in concert with a surgeon from Madison, Wisconsin, who's a trauma surgeon. He's like, Foss, I love what you're talking about, but I don't understand it. Can you help me understand it? And together we rewrote the paper to make it a little more simplified. But in doing so, we also updated the data because we're 1 year further into this. And as you mentioned, credit default swap spreads have widened, debt burden has increased. The price of Bitcoin, for a number, the intrinsic value of Bitcoin has doubled. So last year, I was able to say that the intrinsic value of Bitcoin is X. I'm not going to spill the beans until it comes out. It will come out within the next 30 days.
Okay.
Now, for a relative value, the intrinsic value of Bitcoin is 2X, but it's currently trading at 0.4X. Okay. It's trading at 0.4X and it's worth 2X, meaning it's 70 or 80% undervalued.
Right. And so that adjusts your risk return ratio.
Absolutely. And by the way, that's only one valuation metric. I'll still stand by my number. I'm going to say it on your podcast. I said it in Las Vegas. Bitcoin is worth, in my opinion, $2 million US in today's dollars today.
Right.
And it's trading at 40,000, which means it's giving me 1 in 50 odds, 1 out of 50 chance that I'm right. And I'm like, I'm not 100% certain I'm right, but I'm way more confident I'm right than 1 in 50. So giddy up, ship it in. I'm a buyer at 40,000 because I think that I'm at least 50% comfortable giving my $1 or $2 million price target. For those that aren't following along, it basically says that I'll be a buyer of Bitcoin up until $1 million in today's dollars of Bitcoin. Otherwise, I think the market is wrong. And that's what happens. You need to call out markets, or when you go to a racetrack or when you go to a craps table and you feel that you have the odds on your side, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to lay down a bet that will attract the return based on those odds.
Right.
And all I'm saying right now to you and your listeners is the price of Bitcoin is so stupid cheap that I need to lay down a bet that will pay me to capture the odds in my favor. Not 100% certain, but the odds are in my favor.
Yeah. Good stuff. Well, with that, I think that's a good place to end it. We're going to go ahead and sign it off at that point. $2 million price target, 1 in 50 odds. I would agree with you. It's much better than that. So yeah, with that, we'll sign it off. So
I want to say one final thing.
Yeah,
it's a target, not a limit. It's a target, not a limit, because people will come at me and go, Foss, why so bearish? And I'll be, well, if your target is way higher, I'll promise you it still has to go through my target before it hits your target. Okay. So just don't overthink things. This is the best asymmetric trade and investment opportunity I have ever seen. If you own zero, you're taking way more risk than if you own a proper portfolio allocation to this investment.
Yeah. All right. You can find Greg Foss on Twitter at Foss Greg Foss. And if you get a strange DM from him asking how your trade is going, don't reply to that. I've gotten some of those, Greg.
Oh, brother. I did 3 today. I actually reported 3 impersonators. So I'm doing my best to chat. This is one of the downfalls of Twitter, right? But otherwise, I love the social platform.
Yeah. All right, man. With that, we'll sign it off. Come see Greg at Market Disruptors Live 2022.
Yes.
There's a link down below.
Can't wait.
We'll be in Bitcoin 22 in April. With that, we'll let it go. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Os, brother. Thank you.
See ya.
Thank you, brother.
All right, that's a wrap with Greg Foss. Hopefully you enjoyed that. It's a good time talking to him every single time we get together because I always learn so much. And as an expert bond trader who spent 30 years doing it, I have so many good questions. So hopefully you enjoyed that. Now, as I said before, and we talked about it on the interview, do not miss Market Disruptors Live 2022. Come hang out with Greg and I, as well as Harry Daniel DiMartino Booth, Jeff Booth, George Gammon, and so many more. There's a link down below with more info. Come meet us. Come ask questions. Build relationships. Build a community. It's an important reason to come. There's a link down below. And then, of course, as always, give me a thumbs up on this video if you liked it. If you don't like it, that's okay. Give me a thumbs down. But at least leave me a comment and let me know what you think. And that's what I got for you. All right, to your success. I'm out.